The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, but Emma Hartford felt no warmth from its golden rays. She stood before the cracked mirror in the town's only boarding house, her hands trembling as she attempted to pin the yellowed lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother. The fabric felt like chains around her shoulders. "Emma, dear, you need to hurry," called Mrs. Abernathy from the doorway, her voice filled with forced cheerfulness. "Mr. Thornfield doesn't like to be kept waiting." Emma's reflection stared back at her, pale green eyes wide with fear, auburn hair pulled too tightly into an elaborate bun that made her head ache, and a dress that had been hastily altered to fit her slender frame. At 19, she should have been choosing her own path, not being sold like livestock to settle her father's debts. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of preparation echoing through the boarding house. "Nonsense." Mrs. Abernathy bustled into the room, adjusting Emma's sleeves with rough efficiency. "Marcus Thornfield is the wealthiest man in 3 counties. You'll want for nothing. Except freedom," Emma thought bitterly. Except choice. Except love. She had met Marcus Thornfield only twice before this day. The first time, he had looked at her the way men examined horses at auction, calculating her worth, checking her teeth. The second meeting had been to discuss terms with her father, and Emma had been dismissed like a child, while the men negotiated her future over whiskey and cigars. Thornfield was 43 years old, twice widowed under mysterious circumstances, and known throughout the territory for his ruthless business practices. His ranch hands whispered stories about his violent temper, and even the sheriff seemed to look the other way when complaints arose about the Thornfield spread. "My father promised me more time," Emma said, grasping for any delay. "He said I could finish helping with the harvest." "Your father's debts won't wait for harvest, child." Mrs. Abernathy's tone grew stern. "The bank would have seized the farm by now, if not for Mr. Thornfield's generosity. This marriage saves your family from ruin." Emma closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Her younger siblings, 12-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Mary, would have nowhere to go if the farm was lost. Her mother, weakened by years of hard work and poor health, couldn't survive starting over in some distant city. This marriage was a sacrifice, but one that would secure their future. The sound of horses and carriages gathering outside made her stomach clench. Through the thin walls she could hear men's laughter and the clink of bottles, Thornfield's associates celebrating his acquisition of a young bride. To them, this wasn't a wedding, it was a business transaction. "I need some air," Emma said suddenly, pushing past Mrs. Abernathy. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes, the older woman called after her. Emma rushed down the narrow staircase and out the back door of the boarding house, lifting her heavy skirts to avoid tripping. The alley behind the building was empty, except for a few chickens pecking at scraps. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, gulping the cool morning air. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. Through a gap in the buildings, she could see the imposing figure of Marcus Thornfield himself, dressed in an expensive black suit and speaking in low tones to 2 of his men. His face was hard as granite, his dark eyes cold and calculating. This was the man who would control every aspect of her life within the hour. "Make sure the preacher understands his role," Thornfield was saying. "I want this done quickly and legally. No romantic nonsense." "What about the girl's family?" one of the men asked. Thornfield's laugh sent chills down Emma's spine. "They'll do as they're told. They have no choice now." Emma's heart pounded as she realized the full extent of her trap. This wasn't just about saving her family's farm. Thornfield had deliberately maneuvered them into this position. He had wanted her specifically, and he had orchestrated their financial ruin to get her. As the men moved away, Emma remained frozen against the wall, her mind racing. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Marcus Thornfield, bound to a man who saw her as property to be acquired and controlled. The thought of his hands on her, of sharing a bed with someone who had bought her like cattle, made her physically sick. The church bell began to toll, signaling the gathering of wedding guests. Emma looked toward the end of the alley, where she could see the muddy bank of the Snake River glinting in the distance. The water was high from recent rains, rushing fast and dangerous toward the distant mountains. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Emma Hartford stood at the crossroads of her life, listening to the bell that would seal her fate and staring at the wild river that represented the only escape she could imagine. Chapter 2. Into the Current. The interior of Bitter Creek's small church was suffocating despite the cool October morning. Emma sat rigidly in the front pew, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The borrowed wedding dress felt like a costume for a role she never wanted to play. Marcus Thornfield stood beside the altar, checking his pocket watch with visible impatience. At 43, he was still a handsome man in a brutal sort of way, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. But Emma had learned to recognize the cruelty that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Morrison, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, "we are gathered here today." Emma's attention drifted to the window beside her, where she could see the Snake River winding through the valley like a silver ribbon. The water was running high and fast from the autumn rains, carrying logs and debris downstream toward the distant territory of Idaho. She had grown up near that river, had learned to swim in its calmer pools during summer months when the current was gentle and forgiving. "Emma Hartford," the Reverend's voice cut through her reverie, "do you take Marcus Thornfield to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The church fell silent. Every eye was fixed on her, waiting for the words that would seal her fate. She could feel Thornfield's gaze burning into her, could sense his growing irritation at her hesitation. Emma's voice caught in her throat. She looked toward the back of the church, where her family sat in their best clothes, clothes that had been mended and remended over the years, as their circumstances grew increasingly desperate. Her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears, while her father stared at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. Young Thomas was watching her with confusion, not fully understanding why his sister looked so frightened on what should have been a happy day. 8-year-old Mary had fallen asleep against their mother's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the transaction taking place. "Miss Hartford?" Reverend Morrison prompted gently. Thornfield stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Don't embarrass yourself, girl. Your family's future depends on your answer." The threat was clear, and Emma felt the last of her resolve crumble. She opened her mouth to speak the words that would bind her to this man forever, when suddenly the church door burst open, with a crash that made everyone jump. "Fire!" shouted old Jake Peterson, one of the town's storekeepers. "The Morrison barn's caught fire. We need every able-bodied man." Chaos erupted as men began pushing toward the exits, their sense of community duty overriding even a wedding ceremony. Thornfield cursed under his breath, his carefully orchestrated event dissolving into pandemonium. "The ceremony will have to wait," Reverend Morrison announced, already removing his vestments. "Mrs. Morrison keeps her prize horses in that barn." In the confusion of people rushing past, Emma saw her chance. While Thornfield was arguing with the Reverend about continuing the ceremony despite the emergency, she slipped out of the pew and moved toward the side door that led to the church garden. Her heavy skirts made stealth difficult, but the noise and commotion covered the sound of her movement. Once outside, she hiked up her dress and ran, not caring who might see her undignified flight. The wedding shoes, borrowed like everything else she wore, were impractical for running, so she kicked them off and continued barefoot across the rough ground. Behind her, she could hear Thornfield's voice rising above the chaos. "Where is she? Where's my bride?" Emma reached the riverbank just as the search for her began in earnest. The Snake River stretched before her, dark and swift, carrying the promise of freedom and the threat of death in equal measure. She had always been a strong swimmer, but never in water this cold, this fast, wearing pounds of soaked fabric that would drag her down. "Emma!" Thornfield's voice was closer now, filled with rage rather than concern. "Get back here, you foolish girl!" She turned to see him striding through the tall grass, his face twisted with fury. Behind him came two of his ranch hands, men she recognized as enforcers rather than cowboys. Whatever kindness Thornfield had shown during their brief courtship was gone now, replaced by the true nature that his previous wives had undoubtedly known all too well. "You belong to me now," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "The papers are signed. Your father's debts are paid. There's nowhere for you to run." Emma looked back at the river, then at the man who had bought her like livestock. The choice was no choice at all, a life of captivity and abuse, or the slim chance of freedom that the wild water offered. "I'd rather drown than be your wife," she called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Before Thornfield could respond, before she could lose her courage, Emma Hartford gathered her skirts in one hand and stepped into the rushing water of the Snake River. The cold was like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and making her heart stutter. The current immediately caught her heavy dress, pulling her away from the shore with frightening speed. As the dark water closed over her head, Emma's last clear thought was a prayer, not for rescue but for her family to understand why she had chosen the river's mercy over Marcus Thornfield's cruelty. Chapter 3. The Quiet Rancher. Samuel Carter had been tracking the injured mare for 3 days through the rough country north of Bitter Creek when he heard the commotion from the river. His own horse, a steady bay gelding named Jasper, lifted his head at the sound of shouting voices carrying on the autumn wind. Sam was a man who noticed details. It had kept him alive during his years as an army scout, and it served him well now as a solitary rancher, trying to build something lasting in the Wyoming Territory. At 32, he had learned that survival often depended on reading the signs others missed, the way animals moved when danger was near, the sound of weather changing in the mountains, the tone of a man's voice when he meant violence. The voices coming from the direction of the Snake River carried that particular edge of panic and rage that made his instincts prickle with warning. He guided Jasper carefully down the slope toward the riverbank, staying within the cover of the cottonwood trees. Sam had learned long ago that it was better to understand a situation before becoming part of it. Too many good men had died rushing blindly toward trouble. Through the yellowing leaves, he could see several figures on the opposite bank, well-dressed men who looked out of place in the wilderness. One of them was shouting orders, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Even at this distance, Sam recognized Marcus Thornfield from his distinctive silhouette and imperious manner. "Find her!" Thornfield was yelling to his men. "She can't have gone far in that dress." Sam's attention shifted to the river itself, his experienced eyes reading the current and debris patterns. The snake was running high and dangerous, carrying whole tree branches and chunks of riverbank torn loose by the recent rains. Nothing human could survive long in that churning water, especially not there. A flash of white fabric caught between 2 fallen logs about 50 yards downstream. Sam's heart clenched as he realized what he was seeing. A woman in what looked like a wedding dress, her auburn hair dark with river water struggling weakly against the debris that had temporarily trapped her. Without hesitation, Sam spurred Jasper into the water. The gelding was mountain-bred and sure-footed, but even he struggled against the current as they fought their way toward the trapped woman. Sam could see she was barely conscious, her face pale as death, her lips blue with cold. "Easy, Jasper," he murmured to his horse, guiding them carefully around the worst of the current. "Easy now." As they drew closer, Sam could see that the woman was young, probably no more than 20, and that her elaborate dress had likely saved her life by catching on the logs. But the same fabric that had stopped her from drowning was now threatening to drag her under, as the sodden material grew heavier with each passing second. "Miss," he called out, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation, "I'm going to get you out of there. Don't try to move." Her green eyes opened, focusing on him with difficulty. She tried to speak, but only managed to cough up river water. Sam could see she was weakening fast, her grip on the logs loosening as exhaustion and cold took their toll. Moving with practiced efficiency, Sam secured his lasso around the saddle horn and dropped a loop into the water near the woman. "Can you get your arm through this?" he asked. She nodded weakly, managing to slip one arm through the rope despite her trembling. Sam immediately began backing Jasper away from the debris, using the horse's strength and his own skill to pull her free of the logs without letting the current sweep her further downstream. The rescue took every bit of Sam's frontier experience. He had to read the water, anticipate how the current would affect both the woman and his horse, and time every movement perfectly. One mistake would send all 3 of them into the deadly rapids downstream. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sam managed to get the woman close enough to Jasper's side that he could reach down and pull her from the water. She was dead weight in his arms, her waterlogged dress making her nearly impossible to lift. But Sam had handled plenty of difficult rescues during his army days. Once he had her secured in front of him on the saddle, Sam guided Jasper toward the near bank, away from where Thornfield and his men were still searching. The woman was unconscious now, her breathing shallow and her skin dangerously cold. She needed shelter, warmth, and dry clothes immediately, or hypothermia would finish what the river had started. Sam's cabin was only 2 miles away, hidden in a grove of aspens where he had built it specifically to avoid unwanted visitors. As Jasper carried them steadily homeward, Sam found himself studying the woman's face. Even unconscious and nearly drowned, there was something about her that suggested strength, a determined set to her jaw that spoke of someone who had fought hard before giving up. The elaborate wedding dress told its own story. No woman ended up in the Snake River wearing such finery by accident. Someone had been running from something, and given Thornfield's presence at the scene, Sam could guess what that something was. He had heard rumors about Thornfield's previous wives, whispered stories that the respectable folks in town preferred not to discuss openly. Both women had died young, and both deaths had been explained away as accidents or illness. Sam had never paid much attention to gossip, but looking down at the half-drowned woman in his arms, he began to understand why someone might choose the river over Marcus Thornfield's idea of marriage. By the time they reached his cabin, the woman was shivering uncontrollably, her lips purple with cold. Sam carried her inside and laid her carefully on his bed, then immediately set about building up the fire in his stone hearth. The cabin was small but well built, designed to hold heat during the brutal Wyoming winters. As the flames caught and began to warm the single room, Sam faced the delicate problem of getting his patient out of her wet clothes. The heavy dress was literally freezing to her skin, and leaving it on would likely kill her, but propriety demanded he preserve her modesty. In the end, practicality won out over convention. Sam had seen enough death during the war to know that false modesty was a luxury the dying couldn't afford. Working quickly and efficiently, he removed the sodden wedding dress and wrapped the woman in warm blankets, placing heated stones from the fire near her feet and sides to combat the hypothermia. Only then did he allow himself to really look at her face. She was beautiful in a quiet, natural way that had nothing to do with paint or artifice. Her auburn hair, now drying in the firelight, framed delicate features that spoke of intelligence and determination. This was not a woman who would have entered marriage with Thornfield willingly. As if responding to his thoughts, her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with confusion and fear. "You're safe," Sam said quietly, keeping his voice gentle. "You're in my cabin. The river nearly took you, but you're going to be all right." She tried to sit up, then seemed to realize she was wearing only blankets. A flush crept up her neck, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered. I thought I was going to die." "You nearly did," Sam replied honestly. "That was a dangerous gamble you took with the Snake River. Mind telling me why you thought drowning was preferable to whatever you were running from?" Her green eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "Because some things are worse than dying," she said simply, "and I'd rather die free than live as Marcus Thornfield's property." Chapter 4. Sanctuary in the Wilderness. Emma had been unconscious for nearly 6 hours by Sam's reckoning when she finally opened her eyes again. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. She lay still for several minutes, taking in her surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust easily. The cabin was small but solidly built, with thick log walls chinked against the wind and a stone fireplace that radiated welcome warmth. Simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, spoke of a man who valued function over decoration. Everything was clean and orderly, maintained by someone who understood that carelessness could mean death in the wilderness. "You're awake," came a quiet voice from the corner where Sam sat repairing a bridle. "How do you feel?" Emma struggled to sit up, acutely aware that she was wearing only a man's flannel shirt and wrapped in blankets. The memory of nearly drowning came rushing back, along with the terrifying realization of what her escape attempt meant for her family. "My dress," she said, looking around frantically. "Ruined," Sam replied matter-of-factly. "The river and the cold would have killed you if I'd left it on. I've got some clothes that might fit you, belong to someone who used to live here." Something in his voice suggested painful memories, but Emma was too desperate to probe. "I have to go back," she said, trying to stand on unsteady legs. "My family, Thornfield will make them pay for what I did." "Sit down before you fall down," Sam said firmly, moving to steady her with gentle but implacable hands. "You've been hypothermic for hours. Your body needs time to recover." "You don't understand," Emma protested, even as her legs betrayed her, and she sank back onto the bed. "He owns my father's debts. Without the marriage, he'll destroy them. He'll take the farm and my siblings will starve." Sam studied her face carefully. In his years as an army scout, he had learned to read people as accurately as he read weather patterns and animal tracks. This woman wasn't hysterical or given to dramatic exaggeration. She was stating facts as she understood them, and those facts terrified her. "Tell me about these debts," he said, settling into the chair beside the bed. Emma found herself responding to his calm, steady manner. There was something about Samuel Carter that invited trust. Perhaps it was the way he listened without judgment, or the competent gentleness with which he had cared for her. She found herself telling him everything: her father's failed crops, the mounting debts, Thornfield's calculated manipulation of their financial ruin. "He planned it all," she concluded, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "He wanted me specifically, and he engineered our desperation to get me. The marriage was never about love or even convenience. It was about ownership." Sam was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had told him. He had served with enough officers during the war to recognize the type: men who saw other human beings as resources to be acquired and exploited. Thornfield fit the pattern perfectly. "Your family thinks you're dead," he said finally. Emma nodded, tears threatening. "It's better that way. If they think I drowned, maybe Thornfield will leave them alone. Maybe he'll find some other way to recoup his investment. Or maybe he'll take his frustration out on them," Sam pointed out gently. "Men like Thornfield don't like to lose, and they tend to blame everyone around them when things don't go their way." The truth of his words hit Emma like a physical blow. In her desperate flight from forced marriage, she may have condemned her family to even worse treatment. Thornfield's rage would need an outlet, and her father and siblings were the most convenient targets. "What have I done?" she whispered, burying her face in her hands. Sam watched her struggle with guilt and despair, recognizing the internal battle. He had fought similar demons during his own dark periods, times when survival had required choices that haunted him long afterward. "You chose freedom over slavery," he said quietly. "That took courage." "Courage?" Emma laughed bitterly. "I ran away like a coward, leaving my family to face the consequences." "You were 19 years old, being forced into marriage with a man twice your age, who had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances," Sam replied. "What would you call the alternative?" Emma looked up at him, seeing no pity in his weathered features, only understanding. "You know about his wives." "I know rumors. I know that healthy young women don't usually die of mysterious illnesses within a year of marrying wealthy men." Sam's voice carried the weight of hard experience. "I also know that men who buy brides don't usually treat them with kindness." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the wind in the aspens outside and the comfortable crackle of the fire. Emma found herself studying her rescuer more closely. Samuel Carter was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His features were too weathered, his manner too quiet, but there was something solid and dependable about him that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. Sam considered the question carefully. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. "Woman drowning in the river, man with a rope and a good horse. Doesn't take much thinking. But you could have left me on Thornfield's side of the river. Could have let his men deal with me." "Could have," Sam agreed. "But I've seen enough of what men like Thornfield do to people they consider their property. Figured you deserved better." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the despair that had been her constant companion for weeks. Here was a man who had risked his own safety to save a stranger, who asked nothing in return, who treated her as a person rather than an object to be negotiated over. "I don't even know your full name," she realized. "Samuel Carter. Most folks call me Sam." He gestured toward the cabin around them. "This is my place. About 50 acres of good grazing land and a water source that doesn't freeze in winter. I run a small herd, do some hunting and trapping, keep to myself mostly." "It's beautiful," Emma said, meaning it. Through the window she could see rolling hills covered with golden aspen trees, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was wild country, hard country, but there was a freedom in its vastness that called to something deep in her soul. "What will you do now?" Sam asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Emma had no money, no family she could turn to without endangering them further, no skills that would support her in a frontier town. She was entirely dependent on the kindness of a stranger, and that kindness couldn't last forever. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'll have to find work somewhere. Maybe in one of the mining towns where they don't ask too many questions about a woman's past." Mining towns are dangerous places for women alone, Sam said carefully. Especially women who look like you. Emma understood his meaning and felt heat rise in her cheeks. I won't be anyone's property again, she said firmly. Not Thornfield's, not some miners, not anyone's. I wasn't suggesting that, Sam replied. I was thinking more along the lines of honest work. I could use help around here, someone who can cook, mend, help with the animals when needed. It's not easy work and the pay wouldn't be much, but you'd have a roof over your head and no one asking questions about where you came from. Emma stared at him in amazement. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to earn your keep while you figure out what comes next, Sam corrected. No strings attached. You'd have your own space, your own responsibilities. What you do with your life after that would be up to you. For the first time since her father had announced her engagement to Marcus Thornfield, Emma felt a flutter of hope. Here was a path she hadn't considered. Not marriage, not prostitution, not destitution, but honest work and genuine independence. Why would you do this for me? She asked. Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried old pain carefully contained. Because everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path, he said simply. And because I know what it's like to feel trapped by other people's expectations. Emma studied his profile, seeing the shadows of his own untold story in the lines around his eyes. Whatever had brought Samuel Carter to this remote cabin, whatever had taught him to recognize another person's desperation, she sensed it had cost him dearly. I accept, she said quietly, and thank you for the rescue, for the offer, for treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. Sam nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. We'll start tomorrow then. Tonight you rest and get your strength back. Tomorrow, we'll see about making you a place in this world that's truly your own. As darkness settled over the valley, and Sam prepared a simple supper, Emma felt something she had almost forgotten, the possibility of a future she could choose for herself. Chapter 5. Building a New Life. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's near drowning, and the rhythm of life at Sam's ranch had begun to feel natural. The autumn air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and both Sam and Emma worked with the focused intensity of people preparing for the harsh months ahead. Emma had proven herself more capable than either of them had expected. Growing up on a struggling farm had taught her skills that translated well to frontier life. She could milk cows, tend chickens, preserve meat, and mend everything from torn clothing to broken harnesses. More importantly, she had the kind of practical intelligence that saw problems coming and found solutions before crises developed. The creek's running lower, she observed, as she returned from filling water buckets. Should we be concerned about the spring freezing this winter? Sam looked up from the fence post he was setting, impressed as always by her attention to detail. It's fed by underground springs, so it shouldn't freeze completely, but you're right to watch it. Water's life out here. They worked in comfortable companionship, each focused on their tasks, but aware of the other's presence. Sam had given Emma the small storage room off the main cabin, and she had transformed it into a neat private space, with a bed, a chest for her few belongings, and curtains made from fabric salvaged from her ruined wedding dress. The arrangement was unconventional by any social standard, but it worked. Emma earned her keep through honest labor, and Sam gained a partner whose skills complemented his own. Neither spoke of anything beyond the practical necessities of their shared work, but both found themselves stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. "Riders coming," Sam said suddenly, his voice sharp with warning. Emma's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distant figures approaching from the south. Even at this distance, Marcus Thornfield's imposing silhouette was unmistakable, flanked by 2 of his men. They rode with the purposeful confidence of people who expected to get what they came for. "Get inside," Sam said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. "Stay out of sight until they're gone." "No," Emma said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of running. If he's found me, then it's time to face this." Sam studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying to hide but also recognizing the steel underneath. "This isn't your fight alone anymore," he said simply. "We'll face it together." The riders drew closer, and Emma could see Thornfield's face clearly now. 3 weeks of searching had not improved his temper. His dark eyes blazed with fury, and his mouth was set in the hard line of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. "Samuel Carter," Thornfield called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from the fence. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't believe I do," Sam replied evenly, not moving from his position beside the fence post. "Everything on this ranch belongs here." Thornfield's gaze shifted to Emma, who stood beside the cabin with her chin raised and her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Miss Hartford, you've caused considerable trouble with your dramatic escape attempt." "I've caused trouble?" Emma stepped forward, anger overriding fear. "You manipulated my family into debt, bought me like livestock, and tried to force me into a marriage I never consented to. The only trouble here is what you created." One of Thornfield's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Sam's rifle came up in one fluid motion, its barrel pointing directly at the man's chest. "I wouldn't," Sam said conversationally. "This is my land and you're not welcome here." Thornfield held up a hand to stop his man, but his eyes never left Emma. "The marriage contract was legally binding. Your father signed the papers. The debts were paid." "There was no marriage," Emma replied. "The ceremony was interrupted, remember, by a fire that needed fighting. I never said the words that would have bound me to you." "A technicality," Thornfield dismissed. "How your father took my money, which you used to manipulate him into desperation," Emma interrupted. "You deliberately destroyed our crops, bought up our debts, and cornered my family into a position where they had no choice. That's not a legitimate business transaction. It's extortion." Sam watched the exchange with growing admiration for Emma's courage and growing concern about Thornfield's barely controlled rage. Men like this didn't accept defeat gracefully, and they tended to escalate situations when they didn't get their way through intimidation alone. "You'll come with me now," Thornfield said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been successfully defied. "This charade has gone on long enough." "No," Emma said simply. "I won't." "Then you'll be responsible for what happens to your family," Thornfield snarled, his civilized mask finally slipping. "Your father's farm, your mother's health, your siblings' future, all of it depends on your cooperation." Emma felt the familiar grip of fear around her heart, but this time it was tempered by 3 weeks of growing strength and independence. She was no longer the desperate girl who had thrown herself into the Snake River. She had found work, purpose, and something approaching peace in this remote valley. "My family's problems existed before I came here," she said steadily, "and they'll have to be solved without sacrificing my freedom." "Your freedom?" Thornfield laughed harshly. "Look around you, girl. You're living in a shack in the middle of nowhere, working like a common servant. This isn't freedom. It's exile." "It's choice," Emma replied. "Something you've never understood." Sam had remained silent during the exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly, his rifle still ready but not directly threatening. "I think you've said what you came to say, Thornfield. Time for you to leave." "This isn't over, Carter," Thornfield warned. "That woman belongs to me, legally and financially. I won't be cheated out of what I paid for." "Miss Hartford belongs to herself," Sam said quietly, "and she's under my protection now. I suggest you remember that." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Emma could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface. Thornfield was a man accustomed to getting his way through wealth and intimidation, but Sam Carter was clearly not impressed by either. "You're making a mistake, Carter," Thornfield said finally. "I have resources you can't imagine. I can make life very difficult for people who cross me." "I've faced worse than you," Sam replied with quiet confidence, "and I'm still here." Thornfield wheeled his horse around abruptly, his men following suit. "This isn't finished," he called back as they rode away. "I always collect what's owed to me." Emma and Sam watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then stood in silence for several minutes. The confrontation had changed something between them. They were no longer simply employer and employee sharing a business arrangement. They had faced a threat together, had chosen to stand united against a common enemy. "He'll be back," Emma said quietly. "Probably," Sam agreed. "Men like that don't give up easy." "I should leave," Emma said, though everything in her rebelled against the idea. "I shouldn't bring this trouble to your door." Sam turned to look at her, his weathered face serious. "You're not bringing trouble." Trouble was already here the day Thornfield decided he could buy and sell people like cattle. The question is whether we face it together or separately. Emma felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Together?" "I meant what I said about you being under my protection," Sam said simply. "But more than that, these last 3 weeks, having you here, working alongside you, It's changed things for me, changed how this place feels." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I know it's too soon, and I know you've got every reason not to trust any man's intentions right now. But I want you to know that if you'll have me, if you'll stay, I'd be honored to call you my wife. Not because of contracts or debts or obligations, but because you're the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever met, and I'd be proud to build a life with you." Emma stared at him, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of his proposal. Here was no manipulation, no coercion, no bargaining with her freedom. Here was a man offering partnership, respect, and genuine affection, everything Marcus Thornfield's arrangement had lacked. "Sam," she said softly, "You don't have to answer now," he interrupted gently. "Take all the time you need. But know that whether you stay as my employee, my partner, or my wife, you'll always have a home here as long as you want it." As the first snow began to fall, dusting the golden aspens with white, Emma felt something settle deep in her soul. She had run from one man's idea of marriage, only to find something entirely different, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared work, and the kind of love that grew slowly from understanding and trust. Winter was coming to the Wyoming Territory, but Emma Hartford had finally found her spring. "Ask me again in the spring," she said, smiling. "When the creek runs high and the aspens are green, ask me then, and I'll give you my answer." Sam smiled back, understanding perfectly. Some things were worth waiting for, and some choices deserved the time to be made with full freedom and complete certainty. As they walked back toward the cabin together, Emma realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she chose to be, with exactly the person she chose to be with. Marcus Thornfield could threaten and scheme all he wanted. He could never touch what she had found here in this remote valley, with this quiet, steady man who had saved her life and offered her the chance to truly live it. The snow continued to fall, and Emma Hartford, soon to be Emma Carter if she chose, felt nothing but warmth.